Hello, everyone, and welcome to the course of world history. Today, we are going to tell the big story of a little man who did big things, Napoleonic France. But first, we got to take a step back in time. Our essential question today is, how did Napoleon gain and then lose control of France? So our story is going to drift back to the period after the execution of Louis XVI. Following this execution, the French Republic faced both internal and external threats. They had rebellions out in the frontiers. They had monarchies of Europe terrified that this French rebellion might spread. They wanted to put an end to it. And so the National Convention, the French government, gave near dictatorial powers to this one committee within that government, the Committee of Public Safety. The Committee on Public Safety, to deal with these internal and then external challenges. Now, this committee was led by this gentleman right here, Robespierre. Now, under Robespierre's leadership, this committee is going to oversee the murder of about 40,000 people during a stretch of time known as the Reign of Terror. Many of the people were guillotined as the preferred method of death. Like 16,000 of them were guillotined during this time. So that was internal opposition. For external opposition, the French Republic was facing the army of the First Coalition. This is an alliance of European monarchies dedicated to overthrowing the French Republic and restoring the French monarchy. Now, in order to combat this, the Committee on Public Safety mobilized the whole nation for war. Everyone got in on it. Nearly every French citizen participated in some way, if not as a soldier, and in supplying the soldier or sewing the uniforms. By 1794, the Republic of France had built the largest army Europe had ever seen, about 1 million soldiers. This is at a time where 100,000 soldiers is a big army. A 200 to 300,000 soldier army is a massive army. Previous to this, the largest army in Europe had been about 400,000. France has 1 million. And with this 1 million-man army, France easily throws back their invaders. So France, surrounded by enemies, wins this war, the War of the First Coalition, and actually even captures some territory right up along here. Now, after France's victory, Robespierre isn't needed anymore. The Reign of Terror is going to come to an end. Robespierre argued that it should continue, in fact, used his power to continue to execute enemies of the French Republic. But people had realized that kind of internal enemies were no longer the problem. Robespierre was going after this in an entirely inappropriate way. And in a way, the Reign of Terror ends with the execution of Robespierre himself being guillotined. Now, the Republic, after this, becomes a lot more conservative. They start to roll back some of the reforms made in the French Revolution, starting with a new constitution that is going to restrict voting to a wealthy elite within France. This limits the right to vote to about 30,000 people. So it is not a full democracy. It's not a republic. It's almost like a government of the rich for the rich. This new constitution also creates this group called the Directory to be the executive branch of that government. So instead of having a president, they had this directory, these 5 people who would work together to lead the nation. The idea being that the 5 of them would keep each other in check and that would be therefore less likely to become corrupt. That failed. The Directory ruled France for about 4 years and was a very corrupt government. They did a lot of self-dealing, a lot of dealing of government contracts to friends. People who knew the Directory personally, they got super wealthy, and everybody else was left behind. The Directory was very unpopular. And to stay in power, they increasingly relied on a strong military, which had the power to act decisively. And a strong military leader who acted decisively is exactly why the Directory didn't last. Because this unpopular Directory was overthrown in a coup d'etat, which put a very popular general, young man at the time, Napoleon Bonaparte, in control of France. This is actually before he did the coup d'etat. He was a general at a very young age. How young? Well, Napoleon was their most successful military leader and was made a brigadier general at age 24. 24, brigadier general, leading armies into battle. Now, his victories were important to the survival of the Republic. He did very well fighting in a series of conflicts as the French Republic faced a series of conflicts and a number of coalitions that come up against them. But Napoleon is going to seize an opportunity presented to him to overthrow this unpopular government. And he establishes a new government, which is in theory a republic. He kind of says the Republican type words for a while. But this republic, like the ancient Roman Republic, was going to be led by a council. Now, the ancient Roman Republic had a couple of consuls to check each other's power. Napoleon was going to be the sole consul. And after a little while, he decided he was going to be consul for life. He was never not going to be consul. And then in the end, he's like, let's get rid of this. I'm just going to be emperor. And in 1804, Napoleon gave up the ghost, declared himself Emperor Napoleon I, and famously crowned himself, saying that only he had the authority to crown an emperor. So whereas Charlemagne, the last great emperor in Central Europe, in France, had been crowned by the Pope, Napoleon rejected that and crowned himself. So what did Napoleon do? Well, at home, he focused on some domestic reforms, one of which was positive. The bureaucracy, the government bureaucracy, was going to be based on merit rather than birth or wealth. If you were really good at your job, you got promoted. It wasn't about your family connections or how much money you had when you were born. His most lasting reform, however, was Napoleonic Code. The French Code of Law was kind of a mess. It had a whole bunch of different codes. Napoleon said, we can't be a unified nation unless we have a unified system of laws. And so the Napoleonic Code of Law was created. Additionally, he insisted that in his empire, that the purpose of his empire was to preserve the rights of the French people. But he preserved the rights of the French people by protecting them from seditious ideas. See, all these people who are writing in all these newspapers that France needs to go back to a republic, not an empire, that's not in your interest, because if we're a republic, then I'm not in charge to help you. So I'm going to help you preserve your freedoms by not allowing you to read those newspapers that say that I shouldn't be in charge. And in this way, Napoleon, well, he was a dictator. He was a dictator, right? This was not a free society. It was a society in which even your mail could be read by the government to check for subversive material. All right, focusing outward. Napoleon uses this massive army of the French Republic to expand, the former French Republic, to expand the now French Empire. In 1803, there is a war of a third coalition. Kind of skip the second coalition. We can skip a lot of those coalitional wars. There are 7 total. The war of the third coalition tries to unseat Napoleon. They try to say, do you know what? This guy, he's not the guy that we want. He's not a king. He's an emperor. He's a threat to Europe. We got to get him out of there. But this coalition is destroyed because it turns out that Napoleon, in his merit-based system, is pretty good at war. And he just absolutely shatters this coalition. And by 1807, the French Empire, or its direct allies, now control almost all of mainland Europe. So France itself, what they claim as their own territorial property, is in the dark green. The French satellites are people who are ruled, countries that are ruled by those who were put in charge by France. Like, for example, in Spain, the Kingdom of Spain, the King of Spain is Napoleon's brother, right? Like, Napoleon defeats Spain, puts his brother in charge. And yeah, Spain is still Spain, it's not France, but come on, it's part of the French Empire. The Austrians, the Kingdom of Norway and Denmark, they're like, you know what, we don't want to be taken over. We see that the chips are against us. We're going to go ahead and join. So that really just leaves Great Britain and Russia as the main opponents. Portugal's kind of dominated by British interests at this time. So it is Russia and Great Britain against Napoleon. Now, wherever Napoleon went, he brought reform with him. Some of the things that he did that were actually positive: spread religious tolerance. So the major religious wars that had plagued Europe for so long largely end during the Napoleonic Age. He also spreads the idea of equality for all citizens, and this idea gets picked up in a number of constitutions that pop up through the 1800s in Europe. Now, most of these ideals become European ideals, and they become European ideals in part because of the influence of Napoleon during the expansion of his empire. But these ideas, these are seeds that will grow and sprout at a later time. He did not bring right with him all of these ideas that were immediately adopted. It's like, oh, Napoleon's great. Let's be like Napoleon and have freedom and equality. Didn't work that way. All right. So let's talk about the British. The British were one of the two powers able to resist Napoleon. At the Battle of Trafalgar in 1805, the French Navy is defeated, and an invasion of Britain becomes impossible. They now don't have a navy that can stand up against the Brits. So Napoleon decides to instead isolate Britain economically. If they can't trade with anybody, they'll grow poor. Poor nations are weak nations, and I can defeat them later. But everybody liked the British goods. The British were the lead manufacturing nation in the world at the time. And by 1810, the system was completely failing. Exports were at an all-time high. One of their biggest customers was Russia. British were selling a lot of their goods to Russia. So Napoleon decided to attack the market instead. He targeted Russia in order to weaken that nation and weaken British exports. And in 1812, Napoleon marches 600,000 troops into Russia during winter, which was not a good idea. I thought you were bright, Napoleon. The Russians refused to fight, no major battles. Instead, they just retreat across the countryside, burning all the food and burning all the villages. So Napoleon cannot feed his troops. Without food and water, Napoleon marches all the way to Moscow, captures Moscow. It was burned so that he couldn't get anything and wouldn't have shelter in the winter. And Napoleon has to turn around and go home. Only 40,000 of his troops make it. It is a massive defeat. With France's army destroyed, a new coalition, another coalition, is formed, and France is defeated this time. They don't have an army. Napoleon is captured and sent into exile on the island of Elba, but he escapes because, Elba's not that far from France. It's just off the coast of Italy, and it's easy for him to get some allies to help him out, and he shows up back in France. They didn't want to guillotine him, and they wound up having problems. Upon landing, the new French king, Louis XVIII, sends an army to capture him, and Napoleon says, "Army of the 5th Regiment," I think it was the 5th Regiment, "I am your emperor. If any of you wishes me dead, I am here, shoot me now." They didn't shoot. Instead, they started cheering, "Long live the emperor." They joined Napoleon, they marched on Paris, and Napoleon is back. He takes Paris with the army sent to defeat him, and the War of the Seventh Coalition is launched to remove him again. 7 wars. It's nuts. Napoleon marches an army out to meet him, but this time he is defeated. He goes up against Wellington, the British leader, and is defeated by a combined British and Prussian force at the Battle of Waterloo, 1815. This time they exile him again. They never guillotined him. They never executed him. But they exiled him to the island of St. Helena, which is in the middle of nowhere. Really hard to get to. It's in the South Atlantic Ocean, halfway between South America and Africa. Hard to get back to France from there. Napoleon never escapes that island. He is there until his death about 7 years later. And that, my friends, is Napoleon. I hope you learned something today, and I will see you next time. Farewell.